press the bell icon on the YouTube app and never miss another update.
Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the voice for ethics in international affairs.
Today, our speaker is David Malone, discussing his latest book, Does the Elephant Dance?
Today on Global Ethics Forum, Canadian diplomat and Indian foreign policy expert David Malone argues we have a responsibility to understand India's history, geography, and capability in order to analyze its diplomatic behavior.
What shapes the foreign policy of any country? There are a number of ways one could slice and dice it, but I think history, geography, capability are the three headings in which I'll organize my brief remarks this morning. What we think of as India today, a sort of unified country, occurred a number of times over history under short-lived empires, but by and large, India, what we think of India today, was a set of smaller kingdoms, sometimes republics, sometimes other political entities. And when the British came to India, first establishing a toehold in South India, India was in one of its phases of disintegration. The great Mughal Empire was falling apart. Its control was really only in the north of the country, around Delhi. And it was actually quite easy for the British to establish control, ostensibly in the form of the East India Company, over India. There's a sense in the West, a profoundly mistaken sense in the West, that British Empire was an unalloyed good for India. There were a number of positive features of it, and there are positive inheritance of the British Empire, notably the Westminster parliamentary system that the Indians cleave to. The rudiments of an independent judiciary started under the Brits, the railroads, a few other things. But actually, in economic terms, the Brits were an unalloyed disaster for India. British Empire in India was a project of economic exploitation. It was hugely successful for the Brits. It was catastrophic for the Indians. Over the last 20 or 30 years, economic historians, or historians with an interest in economics, and a number of economists with an interest in history have been trying to map out what the world looked like economically in centuries gone by. And a number of interesting publications have come out of the OECD and other places. They calculate that, as a general proposition, China, over the millennia, contributed about 25% of global output at any given time, with variations, and India anywhere between 18 and 20%, with variations. When the British came to India, India was contributing perhaps 17% to global output. When the British left, India was contributing 2% of global output. That's all one needs to know about the British Empire in India. It fueled the Industrial Revolution in Britain, but there was no Industrial Revolution in India itself. The British saw to that. So the Indians have very little reason to look back fondly on British Empire, and their generosity towards it is surprising in some ways. India's first Prime Minister, Nehru, was already thinking about Indian foreign policy in the 20s and 30s when he had lots of time on his hands sampling the hospitality of His Majesty's jails. Like de Gaulle and Churchill, he was a prodigious writer. He wrote enormously during the 20s and 30s, and then when he was prime minister, as of 1947, he continued to write prodigiously, but in the form of letters and memoranda and so on, and it's an extraordinary experience to read him. How did he see India's foreign policy shaping up? He saw it as primarily anti-colonial, although he was personally a great Anglophile, and he saw it secondarily as primarily Asian, and indeed convened in New Delhi, even before independence, a conference of Asian powers as the British were packing their bags. Finally, on history, I'd say that since independence, there have been three periods of Indian foreign policy. Again, it could be sliced and diced any numbers of ways. This is my way of doing it. Nehru's major preoccupation was to keep India at arm's length from the Cold War. And his way of doing so came to be crystallized in the notion of non-alignment. The philosophy of non-alignment, the instrument, so to speak, guiding Indian foreign policy was to remain free of the entanglements of the Cold War, which led to lasting divisions with Washington, because Washington couldn't understand the greatest democracy of Asia not lining up with the West in the Cold War. Under Nehru, by and large, there was a sense of idealism in Indian foreign policy more than perhaps hard realism, and it came to a hard end with the border war that occurred with China in 1962, that China comprehensively won, India comprehensively lost. And this induced a sense in India that perhaps India had to be more alert to its own interests in the future. Nehru died soon thereafter. His daughter, Indira Gandhi, after a hiatus of 2 years under another Indian prime minister, took over. And she might be described as a hard realist. She took India's interests very seriously. She aligned India much more on the Soviet Union than the mythology of Indian foreign policy at the time allowed. This was a necessity in many ways because India, having rejected Washington in a sense in the early 50s, Washington had aligned quite happily on Pakistan. And China also had aligned quite happily on Pakistan. So India needed a major international power on its side, and the remaining major international power was Moscow. Moscow had little to offer India, but could protect India, for example, in the UN Security Council. When India intervened in the Bangladesh War of Independence, which in effect partitioned Pakistan, it would have been condemned in the UN Security Council were it not for a Russian veto or a Soviet veto at the time.